welcome you all. My name is Matt Robinson. I'm the discipleship minister here at Parkside, and we are in the middle of a series we're calling Contrast, where we're talking about how God has called the church to be strikingly different. And so this morning we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and 6, and we're looking where Paul has written the church in Corinth and told them just that, how God has called them not just to receive grace, but how to be strikingly different. And this morning in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6, Paul is telling the church that they're allowing sin to destroy themselves as individuals and as a community, because they're giving themselves over to moments of emotion and passion, and they're allowing listening to their heart or what their appetite wants to do to create all these sorts of big issues that we're going to read about and talk through this morning. And let me tell you, when sin gets talked about, it's awkward. It's awkward when we talk about sin as a church. And when we look at chapters 5 and 6 this morning, it's going to be awkward too, because it was awkward for them, because they had allowed their personal decisions, their emotions, to become habits. And then over time, they began thinking of themselves more than they thought about their community. And it led to disastrous results. And so we're going to be looking at that. But because Paul is being so direct in some of these stories, this morning we're going to be dealing with issues of inappropriate relationships. We're going to be talking about legal disputes. And we're also going to be talking about just a general inability to control your sexual appetite. Like, those are heavy topics. And Paul deals with them with the church in Corinth head on. And because he does that, it's harsh. And so this morning, before we dig through these passages and before we talk about these stories, I want to set things up with just 3 principles that I think are important for us to hear in how Paul, because of what God did, because of what God created us to be, dealt with sin. So Paul is not giving us prescriptions of how we deal with each and every specific sin. Paul is talking about the heart of the issue. He is saying we were created one way. We've separated ourselves from God, and so now we need to react a certain way. It's not for specific situations, it's for all situations. So before we start, I want to talk about 3 principles that we need to remember when it comes to sin. The first one is God created us, not eyes. God created us to be in a community that is supposed to strengthen each other, comfort each other, and grow all of us. In Genesis, before God created anything, He existed as a community. He was the Trinity, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It talks about that if you read the first couple of chapters of Genesis, that God talked about creation with Himself before He did it. And then God makes man and looks at man and says, it's not good for man to be alone. So right from the very beginning, He created us, not eyes. We weren't made to be by ourselves, off on our own, in our little boxes. We were made to be together. The church in Corinth struggled to remove this me-first mentality that so many people have. And our culture today isn't any different at all. We don't realize how much of our day-to-day life is based on algorithms and computer programs and apps that all they do is give us a me mentality. Whether it's Google, whether it's Netflix, Amazon, or Facebook, all those programs do, all those search engines do, is give you what you think you want. And when we live in a culture of 300 million, over 300 million Americans, with social media, we're going to find somebody that agrees with us. Essentially, we're going to find a me to look at in the mirror. So whatever your political view, whatever team you root for, whatever you're passionate about, there's somebody else in the U.S. that thinks pretty much exactly the way you do, and our culture and technology is going to connect us. And so we live in a world that makes it so simple to never step out of that me mentality. You know, I didn't realize how much of a me mentality I had until we had our first son, Zeke. And I tell you, when you have a baby, you realize how selfish you are. Because you go from waking up when you want to, eating when you want to, going out and doing things when you want to having this little, 6-pound baby telling you when you're going to sleep, when you're going to eat, and if you get to go out and do anything. It's a harsh reality. But we were created to be in community, and even the way we grow as a family, we go from being a mom and a dad to having a child, it reinforces the idea that we weren't meant to be alone. So the first truth, the first principle is God created us, not eyes. And the second one is sin separates and devastates. I think this morning we have to set some things straight about sin. We've got a sin problem in the church, and here's what it is. We don't really understand what sin is, and that's a problem. We have a lack of understanding about what sin is, and because we have a lack of understanding, sin is distorted in our minds, and it's prevented us from being able to deal with it. When we talk about sin, most of the time we only understand it in a legal sense, which leads us to only understand it in terms of guilt. Think about that for just a second. Most people avoid church like the plague because they don't want to come here and find out how guilty they are. They don't need another judge in their life telling them what they're doing wrong. So most people avoid it straight from the get-go because of their understanding of sin, and honestly, because of our understanding of sin. If we don't get an honest view of what sin is, not only will we not be able to deal with it, but it will continue to separate us from our community, and it will continue to separate us from God. In the Old Testament, it was written in Hebrew. Here are some of the concepts and words that get translated as sin. It's a missing, a rebellion, transgression, perversion, evil, impiety. And impiety is just another word for lacking proper or respect or reverence. In Greek, words that get translated as sin in the New Testament are missing the mark, transgression, unrighteousness, impiety, lawlessness, depravity, which is just a state of being corrupt. You think about files that are corrupt on your computer. You can't use them. They affect how you can use other things. An evil desire. We need to move beyond seeing sin simply as guilt and allow sin to be defined primarily in terms of our relationship to God. It's all these things, and if we don't deal with sin, it will separate us and destroy us. We can begin to see sin for what it is when we don't just see it as legal or illegal, but begin to see it as selfish actions that negatively affect others and destroy ourselves. Sin is like the lion on the African savanna that is attacking a group of gazelles, and sin is trying to separate you out and pick you apart. It wants to isolate you. It's dangerous. I had a friend who really shot himself in the foot once. Let me say that again. I had a friend who really shot himself in the foot. Like he literally shot himself in the foot. And this is how it happened. He was out shooting his gun with his friend. They were in high school. They were out in the farms, out in the country. And he thought that he had fired all the bullets in his .22 revolver. And he hadn't. So he had his gun at his side, and he clicked the trigger, and he shot himself in the foot. It's a bad moment, right? That's a mistake. He definitely missed the mark. But then his reaction, I think, is so typical of how we choose to deal with sin. He knew his dad would punish him. He knew he was in huge trouble. So what does he do? He calls 911. No, he doesn't call 911. He doesn't call his parents. He goes back to his bedroom and tries to sleep it off. The man shot off one of his toes, and he thought it would go away on its own. Okay, we laugh at that, but that is truly how we deal with sin. We think that it's something that we can play around with, and sin, because we know we've done something wrong, separates us from who we need to be connected to, the treatment that we desperately need, and it devastates us. We got to deal with sin, because if we don't, not only does it change the grace we're supposed to receive, but it changes the community we're supposed to go to. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 6 through 8, Paul describes sin like a little bit of yeast in bread. A little bit of yeast makes all the bread rise. Our decisions affect others. And sin affects others the same way. You see, it's not just sin separating us and devastating us. Sin is an us thing, not an I thing. Just like that little bit of yeast will affect the whole loaf of bread, A little bit of sin in your life is like thinking about driving your minivan and getting into a car accident with your whole family in it and think that you're the only one who's going to be affected. I mean, imagine that. Imagine driving a bus with your community in it and thinking, you know what, I can get in an accident and it's only going to affect me. This is how we need to begin to change our perspective of sin, because sin is not a personal decision, it's a community decision. And so dealing with sin in community might not be comfortable. In fact, it's going to be messy, it's going to be awkward, it's not going to be fun, but it's necessary. In fact, dealing with sin in community makes life more dangerous and difficult for you in the short term, but gives you a chance of surviving as a family and as a church in the long term. If you see someone that's not preparing for their God-given journey, the best thing you can do is lovingly challenge them. On both sides of dealing with sin, it's an us thing because it's a mess that affects all of us. I don't know if you've ever changed the O-ring or the wax ring in a toilet. It is not a fun experience. Okay, a wax ring on a toilet has to be one of the worst inventions ever that actually does its job perfectly. It's there and it works perfectly until you need to change it. And then when you need to change it, it is the biggest mess ever. There are not enough rags, there's not enough buckets, there's not enough trash cans. For you to change it, it is going to be a mess. And that honestly is what it's like to deal with sin in the church. Don't think you're going to get away with dealing with sin and not getting messy. It's not fun for us to deal with it, but we have to. Paul takes it a step further as he challenges them by telling them if they don't deal with the sin in their life, then they will never be ready for the journey that's ahead of them. What would you do if I told you this morning that you were created for a purpose, but if you didn't change things about your life real quick, you would never accomplish them? It's a big decision, right? There was a guy named Ernest Shackleton, and he had a goal back around World War II to take a group of men down to Antarctica and complete a trans-Antarctic trip, go all the way across. And on the way there, the ice grew around his boat, and it crushed his boat, lifted it out of the water, and the men had to abandon the ship. And their only goal for survival, their only hope, their sliver of chance of surviving was if they made drastic changes. And so Shackleton got everyone out of the boat. And as everyone was out of the boat, he circled everyone up as they were standing on this ice, as they were seeing their boat begin to succumb to the water. And he took everything out of his pockets and began dropping it on the ice. And he took gold coins. He took a watch. He took out a Bible that the Queen of England had given him. And he tore out the note from the Queen, and he tore out a page of Scripture. And he set the Bible down. And he said, men, if we are going to have any hopes to survive, we must cut away everything that does not serve a purpose on this journey. If we are going to be good for what God has for us, we are going to have to deal with the uncomfortable and make tough choices to cut things out of our lives if we're going to have any hopes of reaching a community that is desperate for us. So dealing with sin or having someone else bring sin to our attention is not a pride issue. It's not a self-righteousness issue. It's a wisdom and awareness that makes us encourage each other even when we miss the mark, because we know our decisions affect ourselves, each other, and how others will view the reality of Jesus. Did you catch that? The decisions that you think that are personal, the decisions that I think are personal, that only affect me, that only affect you, will change how our neighborhood sees Jesus. And so whatever you think is just a you decision, it's an us moment. And we have to deal with sin as a community. So thinking about these three principles, I just want us to walk through just a couple specific situations. And while I walk through them, you're going to see the verses behind me and see the specifics of this situation. And the first one we get to is 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 5. And it's a rough situation. There's a man who's having a relationship with his stepmother. And Paul is so taken aback by this. He's so taken aback by the fact that nobody in the church at Corinth seems to have an issue with this, that he's saying, hey, everybody, not even the people who don't believe in Jesus, the people that haven't even signed up for this, even they don't think this is okay. You need to do something. You see, we have to realize that in Corinth, it would have been normal for a man to have 3 ongoing relationships. A man would have an ongoing relationship with his wife. It would be normal for a man to have an ongoing relationship with his servants or slaves. And it would not be abnormal for a man to have an ongoing relationship with temple prostitutes. And so this is not a normal situation as we would understand it in our culture. There was guys getting away with things in the first century that we would look at and go, that is not acceptable. But even in the first century, they looked at this situation happening inside the church and said, hey, this is not okay. And Paul is saying, what you're doing is something that we've got to deal with. And so think about the 3 principles that we've talked about. God created us, not eyes. The decision that this man has made is not happening in a vacuum. He's not acting on a personal feeling. It's happening in community. And his decisions will affect his family, it'll affect his church, and it will drastically change how his community sees who Jesus is. And it flows right into the next thing. Sin separates and devastates. His passions and desires have caused him to elevate what he wants over his value to his family, church, and community. That decision will continually isolate him from the people that need him and the people that he needs most. What he thinks he's getting away with right now is destroying him. And finally, sin is an us problem. You look at this and you can clearly see how his personal decisions are affecting a community. You might read verses 3 through 5 and think to yourself, that sounds pretty judgmental. It's pretty drastic. Paul saying, kick this guy out of the church? Doesn't he need God? Doesn't he need this attention? Paul isn't being self-righteous in this moment. He is performing a spiritual triage in hopes of helping this man recognize the dangerous situation he's in before he destroys his family and before it's too late. Parkside, if we do not address the dangerous choices that we are making, what is only affecting a few of us will very soon affect all of us. If your neighbor lights his apartment on fire, you start to smell something, you go across the hall, you knock on the door, and you see that he's got a fire in his living room, you're not going to try and talk him out of it. You're going to drag that man outside of the house, and you're going to deal with the fire. You're going to call the people that you need to and do something before the whole building burns down. We got to do something about it. In 1 Corinthians 5, 9, 13, Paul goes on to clarify this and speak on a deeper level with this. He says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I'm writing you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you. You see, Paul isn't saying that we should avoid contact with sinful people. He's saying we should avoid people who have signed up to live to a higher standard. Paul says we should avoid people that have said, I will be strikingly different, but are not willing to change anything in their lives. They are creating a joke of a church. They're creating a sham of a spiritual life because they're acting in one way and they're going, really, I love Jesus, but I'm going to go ahead and do what I want. And that's not truly following Jesus. For people that have placed their faith in Jesus, this is a different situation. If you've signed up to follow Jesus, you've committed to live to a higher standard. You've committed to having uncomfortable conversations, whether that's you going to a friend and saying, hey, I've noticed that you're missing the mark. Or your friend coming to you and saying, I've noticed that you're missing the mark. That takes humility on both sides, but it is a desperate need. If we are going to pursue God and help others do the same, we are going to have to be willing to be corrected so others can see what is different in our lives. See, Paul is saying we've got to deal with sin. It's not our job to tell the world how to live. It's our job to take care of how we live so that the world can see Jesus. Because if we're not careful, they're not going to see Jesus. They're only going to see our behavior. Moving on to 1 Corinthians 6, verses 7 through 8, Paul starts talking about the disputes and arguments they're having in the church, and it's not pretty. He says, the very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat, and you do wrong, and you do this to your brothers and sisters. It's like when your mom takes you out to the store and you start to get into an argument, and she goes, back in the car. And you're like, what is going on? And she goes, I'm not going in that store if you're going to act like that. We're done. Whatever I needed at the store, I don't need it bad enough for you to embarrass me like that. They've got these arguments, and Paul must be beside himself because the church is having issues that have gotten so bad that they've failed to handle, that they've failed to look each other in the eye and say, we need to work this out. And they've had to go to a public court to tell them how to live. We were made to be in community with each other, and we have got to find a way to make that work. How do you expect us to be able to help a world with its biggest problems if we can't deal with our own insignificant ones? I was at Nagel Middle School this week with several other people from Parkside, several other staff members, for something they call Go Offline Day. And it's a day where they don't study books, they learn about each other. And honestly, they sit in circles with other classmates, people they hang out with, people they don't hang out with, and they just get to know each other. And they spend this whole day sharing their feelings and hearing where each other's at. And at the end of this day, every year, there are students that apologize to each other. There are students that are experiencing bullying. And they actually have the people that are doing it apologize to them at the end of the day. And what Nagel has realized, the truth, the spiritual truth that they've realized, is that it's not enough to have rules. It's not enough to have guidelines. It's not enough to have knowledge. You need relationship. And so they're getting out of the classroom and getting into each other's lives. And it's this huge light bulb moment where they're going, oh my gosh, I didn't know you. And Paul is saying, you have got to get outside of what is right and wrong. And you need to be willing to be right. You need to be willing to be wronged over being right. Get this, because it's huge. Christianity is about pursuing righteousness, not your rights. Following Jesus is about getting what we don't deserve. So let's stop the urge and the tendency to argue about getting what is coming to us. That's huge. The next time you see something on the news and you think, my right's being taken away. Next time you see something in your neighborhood, a conversation, and you want to respond and have a conversation about your rights, think, how is this going to present Jesus? Is this what Jesus wants me to say? Or can I be okay with being wronged for the sake of Jesus being a bright light in my life? He drives this point home at the end of 1 Corinthians. He says, I have the right to do anything, is what you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything. Paul says, I will not be mastered by anything. You say food for the stomach and stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? And then he goes on to finish that passage. Do you not know your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. In just a minute, we're going to have a time of worship. And I want to begin to prep you all for this time of worship because I want you to have a conversation with God in this time of worship. What I want you to hear and what I want your heart to meditate on right now in regards to sin and the fact that he created us, not eyes, and that sin, separates and devastates, and that sin is an us problem, is that I want you to hear that what Paul took to the church in Corinth was, it is not about you. Your marriage is not about you. Your job is not about you. Your neighborhood is not about you. You might have a remote control by your couch, but this life is not yours to control. It's not yours. It is not about you. And you might think that's an awful thing, but that's a great thing. Because just like the earth revolves around the sun and is not the center of the universe, we are not the center of the universe. You are not the center of the universe. It's not me. It's us. And for God so loved us that he did something so that we could deal with sin. And we need to move beyond grace, accept that grace, and pursue God so we can pursue our community. If we don't deal with sin, we're going to continue to miss the mark. If we ignore it, it will separate us and devastate us. So as we stand and sing, pray to God and say, God, what conversations do I need to have with you? What conversations do I need to have with my community, with my small group, with my Bible study, with my mentors, so that you can deal with the sin in my life, so you can cut those things out? Stand with me. We're going to spend some time in worship. And I want us to pray, God, what sin in my life do I need to start having conversations with my community about? This isn't about me. This is about us.